This is episode 314 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing, president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. I am very pleased to be joined this week by Dr. Jameson Taylor. He is the Senior Vice President for Policy at the Mississippi Center for Public Policy, a sister think tank within the State Policy Network of the Rio Grande Foundation. Welcome to the podcast, Jameson.
Hi, Paul. Thanks for having me on today.
Yeah, well, it is always good to talk to you. We, of course, swim in similar circles and recently saw each other up in northern Idaho, although normally we wind up getting together and chatting at a lot of different events throughout the year. Of course, COVID-19 put a damper on that, and it was good to catch up with you in northern Idaho. But we're not just here for the pleasantries. We're here because of public policy issues facing our states. And before we get into the successes that Mississippi has had, talk a little bit about some of the perceived or the ways you guys at the Mississippi Center for Public Policy look at issues facing Mississippi, and what are those issues?
Yeah, well, Paul, you and I have shared over the years the challenges, common challenges that Mississippi and New Mexico face. As everyone knows, Mississippi is the poorest state in the country. As many people know, we are very dependent upon federal funding and welfare programs and all these types of things. As many people know, we have a lot of serious healthcare and educational challenges here in Mississippi. But likewise, New Mexico has its own share of challenges. And so you and I over the years have kind of shared strategies that we can use in our respective states to make our states better, to make our states, to improve the quality of life in our states. So when we look at Mississippi in particular, we have two challenges that we have to confront. The first, as I mentioned, is that we are the poorest state in the country, and the numbers are very stark. Let me kind of just walk your listeners through with that. So we have Mississippi's median household income is $45,000 roughly, and that compares to $52,000 for our household for New Mexico. That compares to $51,000 for Alabama, which is right next door to us. And then $85,000 for a state like Massachusetts. And the reason I mentioned Massachusetts is because we're here today to talk about educational outcomes. And Massachusetts, just time and again, they have some of the best educational outcomes in the country. And so they're kind of the bellwether that we often look to. Well, what are the things that help kids learn better? What are the things that can improve educational outcomes? But again, so Mississippi having that $45,000 a year household income, we have the lowest per capita income in the country. And New Mexico at $52,000, it may not sound like that much, $7,000 a year, but it's a big difference. And I can tell you this, I've lived in multiple states around the country. I grew up in neighboring Louisiana. And so when you look at these charts and you see, oh, well, yeah, Mississippi's like number 50, but I live in a state that's number 45 or 47 or whatever. It can't be that big of a difference. Well, it's a big difference because this is year after year after year that the state is the poorest in the country. And that puts a lot of pressure on households. It puts a lot of pressure on families, and it's changed the nature of government here in Mississippi. But another thing to think about in Mississippi, a very deep and systemic challenge is our family structure here. So we have the highest rate of single parenthood households here in Mississippi. So children living with one parent. In Mississippi, we have about 46% of children live in single parent families. Now here, we're a lot more similar to New Mexico. New Mexico is at 44% of kids that are living in single parent families. But then when we look at a state like Massachusetts, that number is 32%. So there's a really big difference. Like Mississippi is kind of inching up to almost half of the families in the entire state are single parent households. Whereas you look at Massachusetts, they're more like 1/3. Now, why do I mention these two things, income and family structure? Because the data shows, and there's just decades of data that shows this, that these two factors are very important when we look at how children learn, and when we look at basically educational outcomes. So income and family structure, and of course they go together. If you have two parents in the home, it's more likely they're going to have a higher income. Those parents can work together to, while mom's cooking supper, dad might be reading on the couch to one of the kids. There's just more time for those interactions with the kids, including reading interactions, including learning interactions and things like that. But these two factors are very important. And I say this because I want to kind of put Mississippi's gains within this larger context, that we really are starting at the bottom. And it's not just the bottom in terms of test scores, it's the bottom in terms of family structure and income. But that's also encouraging for what you folks are trying to do in New Mexico.
Yeah, that was a very thorough and reminiscent of a lot of what we deal with here in New Mexico in terms of the challenges we face. Now, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit. Now, I have my list of reforms that I would like to see in New Mexico tomorrow. If I had my proverbial magic wand. Now, one of the things that's very different from Mississippi and New Mexico is the political party structure and who controls things. Mississippi's a deep red state, we're a deep blue state, and it makes our work especially challenging. But you seem to get pretty good purchase with a lot of the Mississippi legislature and the governor in terms of being able to implement policy ideas. So what are the one or two things that you'd really like to see the legislature and governor address in Mississippi? Is it education? Is it something else?
Well, I mean, again, being at the bottom, we have a lot of low-hanging fruit. I think that in terms of education, certainly there's a lot that we can do to improve our educational system, but we also have the worst healthcare outcomes here in Mississippi, and that's something that I've worked very hard in both of those spaces. We kind of talk about ways that the state can move forward. I think it's also important to kind of look back at some of the things that we've done. And so I think we'll get to this in a minute. Kind of one of the first things that we did in terms of educational reform was the third grade reading gate, which was teaching kids, making sure that kids know how to read when they finish third grade. And we can get to that in a minute. But in terms of kind of educational reforms that we're looking at now, one thing, for instance, that we passed at the height of COVID was Learn to Earn. What that does is it creates apprenticeship and internship opportunities for kids, especially what you would call disconnected youth. And there are a lot of these kind of disconnected youth in Mississippi, and I bet there's a lot of these disconnected youth in New Mexico. Now, what am I talking about? I'm talking about, I mentioned the third grade reading gate, which we'll talk about in a minute. Third grade reading gate kind of focuses on the beginning of the student's journey in school. Kindergarten, first, second, third grade, we're giving these kids a lot of tools so that they can learn how to read better. What we do with Learn to Earn is we come at it from the other side, from the other end of older kids who are in 9th through 12th grade. And these kids are kind of on the fence about whether they want to stay in school. When I say disconnected youth, it means that they're not connected to school and they're not connected, for instance, to a job opportunity, and they're probably not really that connected to their families. Because again, here in Mississippi, a lot of these kids are growing up in single parent households. They maybe have not had a lot of support in their family to do well in school. And so they haven't dropped out of school yet, but they're thinking about it. And so what we decided to do was to have targeted outreach to these kids by creating an internship and apprenticeship opportunities for them. Now, here's kind of the vision behind that. If if we can get these kids some inspiration to start to do a good job, for instance, welding or commercial HVAC or being a nurse or something like that, then suddenly they see, oh, wait a minute, there's a reason for me to stay in school because now I see what the trajectory is going to be. I'm going to get my high school degree, then I'm going to go to trade school for a year or two, and then I can get a welding job making literally 6 figures a year. And so we start to show them that, hey, the American dream is possible for you. And what we do in Learn to Earn is we create opportunities for these kids to get connected with employers, to get connected with nonprofits so that they can start to get this kind of training. And in some cases, ultimately even get an occupational license, for instance, to be a nurse or to do that HVAC duties, or electrician, all kinds of things. So we're connecting them with really concrete job opportunities, and that helps these potential kids that could potentially drop out. It helps them to stay in school. So that's something I would encourage New Mexico to look at, is creating these concrete pathways for kids so they can stay in school, but also begin to contribute to the economy as soon as possible. Yeah, in terms of healthcare, I mentioned that we have a lot of healthcare challenges. When I look at healthcare, the most important thing is to increase access to quality care. Mississippi is unique in that we're one of the states that has not expanded Medicaid, but the reason that we have opposed Medicaid expansion is because a lot of Medicaid care is not good care. It's not as high quality care as private insurance plans. So I've been working a lot in the space to create new healthcare options for consumers. And we're seeing some of these things with what are called Farm Bureau insurance plans, which can give folks good insurance coverage at a lower price, telemedicine, all kinds of things like that.
Wow, you've got a lot going on. And definitely it's called Learn to Earn program.
Yeah, that's right. And we passed that at the height of COVID. We're still implementing it, working with employers to create these internship opportunities. The other day I was getting my haircut, and I was talking to my barber, and she said, well, I lived in Virginia, and when I lived there and I got my license to be a barber, I was able to do an apprenticeship. And so we find, like, here in Mississippi, we didn't have that. So that's what we're doing, is trying to create these apprenticeship and internship opportunities to get kids working right away, to whether it's cosmetology or whether or not it's something in helping to build houses. There's all kinds of jobs out there. I don't know what it's like in Mexico, but here in Mississippi, we have help wanted signs everywhere.
Yeah, your governor, I believe, rejected the $300 additional benefit. Like most other red state governors, ours has continued to accept it and is going to through September. So we're probably in different boats there as well. But definitely want to continue the conversation about education, because the upshot is that Mississippi has seen some very dramatic improvements in fourth grade reading scores on what's called the NAEP index, or the National Assessment of Educational Progress. And that's the gold standard of standardized tests, not given to all students. It's a selected sample of students in any given state that take it, but it really is the best way to tell if students in any particular state are improving results, or if they are declining, or what's going on. And before I hand it over to you, Jameson, the idea being that up until fourth grade, you're often, as a student, learning to read, but then after that, you are reading to learn. And if you can't read a word problem or read a science book, you're going to be in a very difficult position. And I caught onto this recently, looking at your NAEP scores, comparing them with New Mexico's, which have been relatively stagnant. But you all in Mississippi have achieved some pretty dramatic successes and improvements in those fourth grade NAEP scores on the reading test. So let's dive into that issue, because that's really the thing that I wanted to talk about with regard to Mississippi.
Yeah, and kind of for listeners that aren't familiar with NAEP, let's say it's a nationally administered test that all states take. So it's an apples to apples comparison. And I've been working in the education reform space for years, and there's all kinds of metrics that we try to use to measure student achievement. For instance, graduation rates. Well, we've kind of seen over the years that graduation rates can be manipulated. ACT scores. Well, that's kind of hard to use because in a lot of states, not every kid takes the ACT. So often you just have your best kids taking the ACT. So that's not, our SAT. That doesn't really measure how well all of your kids are doing. And so the NAEP tests have been implemented nationwide so that as a country, we can have a sense of how well are kids doing in these apples to apples comparisons among the states. And for years, other states didn't really have to worry as much about how they were doing because Mississippi was always last. They could at least take comfort in the idea that they were not going to be last. There's kind of a old saying, "Thank God for Mississippi," and that was kind of the thinking with NAEP. Well, that is no longer the case because, as you have pointed out, Mississippi has seen incredible gains on the NAEP tests. And in particular, when we look at those fourth graders that are taking that national test. And part of the reason for that is a law that was passed in 2013, a law that I worked at here at the Mississippi Center for Public Policy. We call it informally the third grade reading gate. Now, kind of before we get into the nuts and bolts of that law, I want to say that in education, there's rarely just kind of silver bullets. In addition to passing that law, we also passed the law to change the way that we evaluated our districts and schools. And what we did was we assigned letter grading to districts and schools so that parents would have a transparent system to understand how well their school was doing. And prior to us doing that, and we passed this the same year as third grade reading gate in 2013, prior to us doing that, what became a C school was a successful school. And I can tell you that most parents, I know C's and D's get degrees, but I think most parents don't equate getting a C with success. And so that's to say that our Department of Education was kind of manipulating these labels so that parents would feel better about their schools. And so what we did was we changed the way that the schools were rated A, B, C, D, F. And so now when a school is rated a C, not to mention a D or F, everybody knows it. And the parents then want to know, okay, what's going on at the school? Is there a way that we can make progress and become a B school or an A school? So that's one thing we did, but we also did a couple of years later, we passed a program that provides scholarships for special needs students that if they're in a public school and they're not getting the services that they need, then they can get a state-funded scholarship to attend a private school to get the services that they need. So that's helped a lot of kids as well. Another thing we did was charters. And do you guys have charters in New Mexico?
We do have charters.
Yeah.
They're a bright spot.
Yeah. So it's, there's not just one thing. There's usually kind of multiple things that are going on when you have this reform. But a lot of observers point to the third grade reading gate in particular as a reason that our NAEP scores have gone up. And so one thing to think about with that is there are now 16 states that have similar laws on the books, this third grade reading gate. As you mentioned, what the law does is it really focuses on teaching third graders how to read. So how do we do that? There are several different approaches that we take to encourage reading and have a focus on reading, especially in grades K through 3. The first thing that we do is we give all the kids a test. So we give them a test at the end of third grade, and that way we know, can the kids read and at what level are they reading? Now, when we first started implementing the third grade reading gate, we set the bar at basic. So kids had to learn how to read. They had to know how to read at a very basic level in order to pass the test. Now, over the years, we have increased that bar a little bit so that we're requiring better performance from our kids. And this is based upon a very successful model in Florida. Florida, at least in the 90s, had kind of similar demographics to Mississippi. And now Florida's, I'd say it's in a different league. You've had a lot of people that have moved there. They're a top destination state. But in the 90s and late 80s, Florida and Mississippi were not entirely dissimilar. And one thing they did was they implemented this third grade reading gate along with the ABCDF labeling for their schools. And when I saw that, that's one reason that we brought these reforms to Mississippi. They were successful in Florida. They have been successful here in Mississippi. I believe they can be successful in New Mexico. So the first thing we did, though, was we test the kids. So then you have a baseline. The second thing we did was we ended social promotion. And this is a very important piece that we should spend some time on. We can talk about that in just a minute. But if you can't read we were talking basic level. If you can't read at a basic level, then you're not going to go on to fourth grade. Now, the third thing we did is then for those kids that are repeating third grade, we're giving them intensive intervention, tutoring, all kinds of just extra attention to help these kids learn how to read. And then a fourth thing that we did as part of the program is we provided funding for literacy coaches for teachers, because it seems that teachers are not getting the training that they need to teach how to read. And so we refocused on training teachers, giving them these literacy coaches so that they could help kids learn how to read better. So there's four things: testing the kids, 2, ending social promotion, 3, intensive intervention for kids. We're not just leaving them out there and say, good luck, repeat third grade. We hope you do better next time. And then the fourth thing is we're giving teachers additional resources to teach them how to teach kids how to read.
Now, that regime, that program is actually remarkably similar in terms of the reforms asked for or pushed for to what our former governor, Susana Martinez, actually worked to implement. It came out of the Jeb Bush administration down in Florida. It's obviously having success in Mississippi. Governor Martinez here fought tooth and nail for 8 years. The unions opposed her at every turn. They were extraordinarily mean, for lack of a better term, and really disrespectful to the former PED secretary, Public Education Department secretary, a woman named Hannah Scandera. So New Mexico attempted to go down that path, and unfortunately the powers that be did not let that path, that was the path not taken, so to speak. But it sounds like Mississippi has gone down the path and is bearing fruit right now. Would you say that there's anything that specifically Mississippi's done that was not kind of part of the Florida model, or is it pretty much the textbook model there that Florida used?
Well, the thing to think about, I think, one, with education reform, as I mentioned, there are not any silver bullets. And so we, as part of our program, we do have kind of different coursework, kind of that focus on the science of reading and the latest research and that type of thing. And certainly I encourage states to adopt that latest research and use that in their teaching strategies for teachers. And then teachers can carry that over and use that to teach their kids. But the solutions are pretty simple. I mean, so 1, we're going to hold you back if you don't know how to read. 2, we're going to give you extra resources, and we're going to help our teachers do their jobs better. So these 3 things, I don't care if you're in a red, blue, purple state, whatever, these things should not be controversial, but they are. Okay. Mm-hmm. So what we're doing in a lot of states, and some states have this third grade reading gate where they're focusing on teaching kids how to read by third grade. But some states, they don't end social promotion. Now, why? Because they think it's mean. Well, okay. To me, what that's like is, let's put a kid on a diving board. We're going to push them into the pool, and they can't swim too bad. So when you're in first grade, the pool is like 3 feet deep. When you're second grade, it's 4 feet deep. But you get to third grade, it's 5 feet deep. We're pushing you into that pool. You know what? You don't know how to swim? Well, that's too bad. We're gonna, in the next grade, we're gonna move you up fourth grade. Let's imagine that pool's now 6 feet, 7 feet, 8 feet, 9 feet. We keep giving these kids more and more and more work that they're not equipped to do because they can't even read. And we're just pushing them into the deep end of the pool. People say that that ending social promotion, when they say that that's mean or it's not fair to the kids, I think those folks need to take a step back and consider, suppose you're in this child's position. What's better for that child long term, to hold them back a year and then give them the resources they need, give them intensive intervention so that they can be successful in life, or to just keep pushing them through. It's better for their self-esteem. What I say is, again, that's like pushing a kid into the deep end of the pool. What's going to happen to that kid is they're going to drown. So the thing to think about, and what Mississippi has done more than every other state, is really focused on that social promotion piece, which is to say that we are taking this law seriously. So when we look at that, for instance, in 2019, Mississippi held back K through third grade. We held back 8% of kids. Basically, due to the third grade reading gate, we held back 8% of kids cumulatively. And what that means is that we're holding back more kids than that in the different grades. But we're being very aggressive in how we are implementing the third grade reading gate. And when you look, for instance, at Florida, they're holding back about 4% of kids. So we have double the number of kids that we're holding back. That's the thing I think for school administrators to think about, is ending social promotion, making sure that these kids can do the work that they're being asked to do. And here's the side benefits. We're talking about NAEP. We're talking about Mississippi's outstanding improvement on the NAEP tests, but the improvement is translating over to math and science. It's not just reading. And kind of as we talked about, after third grade, kids need to know how to read so that they can learn. It's not just learning to read, it's reading to learn. And so what we're seeing is that since these kids know how to read better, they're able to do their math better, they're able to do their science better. But moreover, those kids that are repeating third grade, they're not just repeating reading, they're repeating these other classes. And then because they start to read better, they can absorb more from their math and science classes. So these kids are seeing gains across the spectrum. And that's why I say, again, if you're going to do this, you have to implement it in the right way.
Well, definitely a lot to like, and a lot of great data showing that you all are seeing success, and no longer can folks in New Mexico even, which we're right there at the bottom with you in so many different ways, except for now, obviously, your fourth grade reading scores, and presumably over time, the rest of your education system is going to be lifted up, and you're going to see a lot of other positive outcomes from these reforms. But one of the things that I know we specifically talked about in person, and you kind of hinted at it, but there's something called LETRS. It's LETRS, and it is a specific program for learning and teaching early childhood reading. Basically, it's a form of phonics education, which of course, that's a specific way of teaching, long-standing way of teaching reading to young children. So is that something specific? That's not a Florida model reform, but can you address what exactly LETRS is and how it was implemented in Mississippi?
Yeah, so the letters program is part of our successful implementation of the third grade reading gate. And kind of, as I mentioned, so, um, and to give your listeners a little bit more context. So when we talk about this program, we are beginning essentially in first grade with this idea of teaching kids how to read. And so we have changed our reading curricula in first grade, second grade, and third grade. And letters is part of that. It's kind of a program that is available that teachers can use to teach these kids how to read better. And so in those grades, what we're doing is kind of refocusing on teaching kids how to read. Now, part of me says, wait a minute. I thought teachers, especially at this level, elementary school teachers, I thought they're already supposed to know how to teach kids how to read. Well, as probably your listeners know, there's kind of the reading wars, that this has been a very controversial issue. How do we teach kids to read? And I know even with my own kids, that they read at a different pace. My daughter, for instance, is extremely smart. She just was not very interested in learning how to read. And my wife tried all kinds of different methods, and none of them really worked all that well because our daughter just wasn't interested. Our son, on the other hand, has picked it up much more quickly. Maybe it's because he's seeing his older sister learn how to read. I don't know. But kids are different. But I think taking a kind of, what we did was a culture change in our elementary school students, so that teachers would kind of refocus on teaching these kids how to read. But again, I think ultimately states need to look at the quality of their teacher training and preparation programs in their colleges and universities. I mean, really, these are programs we should be focusing on, teaching kids how to read at that level, so that we don't have to essentially do remedial education for teachers or extra education for teachers once they get employed in the public school system. But in any event, the letters program has been very successful, and it's something that's being implemented in these lower grades to put a focus on reading. And then, as I mentioned, it provides training for teachers, provides literacy coaches for teachers so that they can teach these kids how to read better. And I'm not going to get into the reading wars and do we teach reading using phonics or not, but the letters program has been very successful here in Mississippi, and kind of being part of that overall program of the third grade reading gate.
All right. Well, I think we certainly have a path forward for New Mexico to look at and consider, and Mississippi has a lot of the answers that we would like to see, followed here in New Mexico in terms of educational success. And just so folks are aware of some of the data and background, I have posted, including a handy dandy chart showing fourth grade reading scores comparing Mississippi and New Mexico going back over a decade. That's at heirsoфenchantment.com. It's an older post at this point, so if you just plug in Mississippi in the search bar, since we don't do a lot of writing about Mississippi at the Heirs of Enchantment blog, but why don't you share a little bit about where folks can find out more about some of the reforms in Mississippi that are succeeding?
Yeah, you can go to our website, mspolicy.org, to learn about programs like this, as well as kind of new educational reforms that we are working on. Again, I think that people need to be open to kind of variety of reforms out there. And as educational reformers, we have two different pathways. One pathway is to improve the system for the public school system for all kids, and third grade reading gate is an example of that. But then there are other pathways. For instance, some kids just aren't doing well in maybe the public school that they're in. And so do you have open enrollment policies, for instance, to get those kids to go to another public school? Or maybe you have scholarships so that these kids in public school can go to a private school. As you mentioned, you have charter schools. So I think the most important thing, especially with COVID, especially with the learning loss that has occurred, which is hitting low-income kids really hard. And if we have time, we could spend a minute talking about that. Especially with COVID, I would encourage policymakers, and I would encourage your listeners to be creative and innovative and open to all the tools that are out there to help states improve their educational systems. And third grade reading gate is part of that, but there are other ideas out there as well that can help improve student performance.
Now, before I let you go, want to check in just, with regard to these reforms, were they bipartisan? Your state, like I said earlier, is more of a Republican-led red state, but are these things that you got widespread buy-in with in terms of the political leadership, or was it pretty much a partisan issue in Mississippi?
Well, I think, talking about even talking about Mississippi as a red state can be a little bit misleading. Frankly, Democrats were in charge of Mississippi for a very long time until about 10 years ago. And so even some of the systemic problems that we have, that if we wanted to kind of think about things in partisan ways, you'd say, well, the Democrats are the ones who put that program in place. So, hey, but some reforms are more partisan than others. I mean, charter schools, for instance, receive bipartisan support. Third grade reading gate has bipartisan support. Others, like providing scholarships for kids to attend private school, gets a little bit of bipartisan support, but it ends up being a very hard-fought battle. I'd encourage folks to kind of set aside their labels and just think about what's best for the kids. What does the data show? And I think that the data shows that if we give kids and parents more options, then you're going to have better educational outcomes. Options and accountability, I think, is going to be key to education reform, as well as transparency, especially with COVID, where like a lot of testing requirements have been waived and things like that. I mean, parents know that their kids are seeing learning losses right now. There's a study from the consulting firm McKinsey that talks about, I think it's more than $100 billion of learning loss that is anticipated to occur because of COVID year after year, not just once, but like $100 billion every year due to the accumulated learning loss that's happening because of COVID. And that's hitting low-income kids in particular. And I'd say, given that kind of crisis that we're experiencing as a country, I'd encourage your policymakers in New Mexico to be bold. That is something that Mississippi has done. We're the bottom. So why not try something new? So I would encourage your folks in New Mexico, try something new. And this, there are programs that other states have tried. They can learn from that and make their program better. And I will say my hat's off to lawmakers here in Mississippi that they have been willing to try new ideas like the third grade reading gate, like charter schools, like school choice programs.
Well, I applaud your sentiment. It almost sounds Pollyannish, though, given the cynicism that we face in New Mexico and the control of the teachers unions. And by the way, Jameson, while you were talking about that, I briefly looked up at burbio.com, burbio.com. It's education-oriented COVID tracker. I looked up the amount of time that they found that students in various states across the country lost thanks to COVID-19, and mostly the policies pulling kids out of school and going to virtual schooling for much of the year and a half or whatever. Mississippi was 75%, slightly higher than 75% in person. They're on or about the 10th best or 15th best. I didn't have time to count. New Mexico, on the other hand, our students lost more time in the classroom thanks to COVID and our governor's lockdowns than all but 5 other states across the country. So when it comes to the rich getting richer, so to speak, and the poor getting poorer, New Mexico is getting poorer because of COVID, not just the lack of reform in our public policy. So I concur wholeheartedly, though. We definitely want to see these education reform policies, and they should not be a partisan issue. So I appreciate your time, Jameson.
Yeah, well,
And
thank you very much, Paul. And your listeners can contact me at mspolicy.org if they want to learn more about some of these ideas.
excellent. Well, thank you for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at tippingpointnm.com or at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube channel. Subscribe to this show at Apple, Stitcher, or have your Google Home play Tipping Point, New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.
Thanks, Paul.
Thank you, Jameson.